if you can't tell, we love you here.
I'm so touched.
I have been counting down the minutes all week for right now.
46.
So I feel so lucky that I actually get to know you in real life a little, and I can't tell you that I could not put your book down.
Oh.
And I'm so excited for all of you who get to read it, because you get to learn so much about her story, and you get to learn so much about all of the incredible work that you've done and continue to do. And have never been more inspired to get to work after reading your book, so thank you for
Cleo.
writing it.
Thank you.
I do want to ask, though, what made you want to write this book, and also have it accompanied with a children's book?
So there were many reasons. A lot of the work I've done has been inspired by people I've met, and probably the first person who inspired me to do everything I do is my mother, who I talk a lot about in the book. And it was an attempt to write about the policy priorities through the lens of personal experiences, but also, especially at this moment in time, to talk about the fact that we also have so much more in common than what separates us as a people. And especially after November of 2016, I think it's really important, when there are so many powerful voices that are trying to sow hate and division among us, to hold on to the fact that the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. And so I wrote the book with the hope that we could speak truths that are shared truths, some of them uncomfortable truths to hear or discuss, but must be discussed if we're gonna build toward a place where we gain and grow trust. Because there's so many people right now who rightly and understandably are distrustful of their government and its institutions and leaders. And one of the most important ingredients in a relationship of trust, and by the way, the nature of a relationship of trust, as we all know in our personal and professional lives, is it's a reciprocal relationship. You give and you receive trust. And one of the most important ingredients in a trusting relationship is that we speak truth. Yeah. And so that's why I wrote the book.
One of my favorite, okay. I think we're just gonna be clapping every time she speaks tonight. I'm ready. One of my favorite things about reading the book is there's so much of your spirit in it. So as you read it, you'll say, and here's another truth, and here's another truth, and that's actually how it's written.
Right. It's because basically, and here's another thing.
It is literally.
And then there's another thing.
It's so spirited in that way, and I love it so much.
Thank you.
Something I always say is that activism is organized storytelling.
Yeah.
And what I loved so much about your book is the way that you took the stories you were hearing and turned them into policy that really affected change. Mm-hmm. And I'd love for you to speak more on that, because it was, as someone who's always kind of more on the activist end of saying, like, okay, we've got to tell these stories then, and then, you writing in such an in-depth way about then what you do with those stories in order to create concrete change within the systems. Right.
Where do I begin? I'll start with part of my life's work, which has been to focus on the criminal justice system. I, for most of my career, was a prosecutor, either as DA in the courtroom, or elected DA, or then Attorney General of California, which comes with the title, as some would call it, the top cop of the biggest state. And my parents, and I talk extensively about this, met when they were active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s in Berkeley and Oakland, California. They met when they were students at the University of California, Berkeley in the 60s. And, right, go Bears. I'm gonna talk about Howard also, go ahead. And so, but a lot of the work that I did was an attempt from inside the system to do what needs to happen around reform of the criminal justice system in our country. And so one of the initiatives that I started back when I was DA and then continued as Attorney General was a reentry initiative, focused on first-time drug sales offenders. And why? Well, because there are a lot of them, and who are occupying a lot of space in the criminal justice system, but as I know them, and I can talk to you extensively about who then came through my initiative and through the programs that we created. There were college students selling drugs on the corner to pay for their books. There were young men and women who returned from Iraq and Afghanistan who were trying to figure out a way to make a living. They were people who otherwise had no other opportunity or thought they had no other opportunity. We're talking about people who had the capacity and have the capacity to do great things if directed in the right way. And those stories and my knowledge of those stories motivated me to create this initiative, which was focused on it's a reentry initiative focused on first-time low-level drug sales offenders and getting them into jobs, getting them into parenting classes. I talk in the book about, in that initiative and another initiative I did focused on children, how, I know that, that when we're talking about parents who are in the system, the vast majority of parents have a natural desire to parent their children, but not necessarily the skills or the resources. So when we are talking about parents whose children are truant, or we are talking about parents who may not have custody of their children, in particular young men, do not mistake that for any lack of love for those children. Yes. And let's create initiatives that are focused on understanding who people really are. And then we will be effective and we will be relevant. So the stories, in large part, are also what one would call empirical evidence, or the data points that motivate the policy.
I think it's amazing your ability to really listen. I think especially at this time where we are constantly saying that we have to speak up and be heard, it just is so comforting to know that there are people like you who are listening and then taking what you're listening and implementing it to create change. Mm-hmm. I think that I kind of want to take it back a little. I think one thing that stops a lot of people from running for office is like, where do I even start?
Right.
And one of the things I loved about reading your book is finding out how you started. There was an ironing board involved, and I would just love to share with our friends here the ironing board of your life.
So when I ran for district attorney of San Francisco in 2003, I challenged an incumbent who had been in the office for 2 terms. He comes from an old political family. His nickname is KO because he was known as being a boxer who knocked people out. When I decided to run, it's because I thought we could do the job better and that the place needed some work. And as you can imagine, well, maybe you can't, but there had never been a woman to be the district attorney. There'd never been a person to be district attorney of that city. There had never been a woman of color to be district attorney of any county in the state of California. And so when I decided to run, people told me what many of you have probably heard many times. It's not your turn. It's not your time. No one like you has ever done this before. They may not be ready for you. It's going to be hard work, as though we run away from hard work. But I didn't listen. And so I started out that campaign at a very healthy 6 points in the polls. For those of you who don't know what that means, that's 6 out of 100.
I love when she defines that in the book, too, because you do say that, and I'm like, oh my God.
No, it's seriously. I'm telling you, Cleo, when I said to my team, when we get to 12, I know we can win. Because it was doubling it, right? And so, to your point, campaigning, what I would do is I would grab my ironing board. Why? I would grab my ironing board, I'd put it in the back seat of my car, and I'd drive to the local grocery stores. And then I'd get out of my car, I'd carry my ironing board, along with my posters and a roll of duct tape. And I would go and stand in front of the grocery store, and I would set up my ironing board. My posters I would drape with the duct tape over one side, because you see, an ironing board makes an exquisite standing desk. And
I love being on this side of all of you as you tell the story, because they're like, okay, but at what point does the ironing board make sense at the grocery store?
Right, exactly. And then I would have all my literature on the ironing board, and then I would, require people to talk to me as they were walking in and out of the grocery store. And that's how we did it.
I am so here for the idea of you in front of the grocery store with the ironing board. I can't even tell you. You know, when you actually start this book off, you say, you have this kind of call to action that says that we have to fight for the soul of our nation.
Yep.
How do you think we're doing?
You know what?
Asking for a friend.
Yeah. And there are lots of friends. Listen, I say this. Anything worth fighting for is a fight worth having. Anything worth fighting for is a fight worth having. And we're not going to sit back then when it's difficult and say, well, what are the odds of winning? So I will decide if I'm going to fight. No, if it's worth fighting for, we fight. We're not going to sit back and think about, oh, this might be difficult and painful. If it's worth fighting for, we fight. And let's be clear about this. This is a fight, and the fights that I talk about in the book, and I think the fights collectively that we're engaged in, are born out of optimism. Let's be clear. This is about fighting for something. And frankly, this is part of the nature of who we are as a country. And that's how I also talk about my perspective, which is we are a country that was founded on noble ideals. Now, we haven't achieved them. But part of this strength is that at our core, we have agreed and been motivated by the notion that we will fight to reach those ideals. That's certainly what my parents were doing when they were marching and shouting for justice on the streets of Berkeley and Oakland, California. The things that the people fought for so that Cleo Wade and Kamala Harris would be sitting on this stage right now.
Yes, indeed.
Right? And so it's born out of optimism, and there is so much to be optimistic about. And so to your point, find a friend, let me tell you. I've been in the United States Senate now for 2 very long years. And let me tell you what I've seen. And let me tell you what I've seen. So my office is in the Senate Hart Building. And my office is right near the door, the entrance to the Senate Hart Building, which is a very big building. But it's right next to the door, and I've got big signs, Dreamers Welcome Here. I've got the rainbow flag, and they were like, why are you putting the rainbow flag? I had to get permission, but I got it. Whatever. And so let me tell you what I've seen since the beginning. I have seen hundreds upon hundreds of dreamers walk the halls of the United States Congress. God only knows how they were able to afford, by train, by car, by bus, to travel from all over the country to our nation, to their nation's capital. I'm sure sleeping 10 deep on someone's living room floor, walking the halls of the United States Congress because they believe if they are seen and their stories are heard, it will matter. That is about fighting because there is a democracy in place, and we still know that if we fight, we won't win them all the time, but it will matter. Same thing with parents who brought from all over the country their children with wide range of disability when we were fighting to keep the Affordable Care Act. From all over the country, parents who, the difficulty and the work that has to happen to move that child from one room to another, much less bring them across country to walk the halls of the United States Congress because they believed if they were seen and their stories were heard, it would matter, and it did, and it made a difference. I saw around the Kavanaugh hearing all these women and men, survivors, many of whom it was the first time they ever told their story, with incredible courage, walking those halls, demanding to be heard and seen and respected. That gives me optimism. That gives me optimism because we are still fighting, and we cannot give up that fight, and we cannot be dispirited. We can't.
You know, when you sit up here and you say the things you say in the way that you say them, all I can think to myself is, who made her? Which brings me to your mother.
Yes.
I want to talk about her.
Okay.
I feel so like I know a few members of your family.
Yes.
I know your husband,
Yes.
and I loved.
My sister's with me.
Yes.
Yeah.
I loved learning about your mom in this book
Yeah.
because when as you sit here, I'm like I feel her.
Yeah.
And
I'm a diluted version of my mother.
you know, how did she set an example for you growing up? And can you introduce our friends here to her?
Yeah. My mother was a force of nature, all 5 feet of her. If you met her and then you walked away, you would have thought she was 7 feet tall. She had 2 goals in her life: to raise her 2 daughters and breast cancer. She was a scientist, a breast cancer researcher. And she was passionate. My mother would take us to the lab with her after school. We would go, or on weekends. And she was so passionate about the idea that we must be focused on what can be, unburdened by what has been. That the quest has to be about what we each can do to improve the lives of others. And so I was raised by my mother and in the context of an extended family, many of whom, were my aunts and uncles who were her best friends, and I talk about them in the book and all of the influence that they had on our lives. And we were convinced that we could do and be anything. And in fact, that's why I wrote the children's book as well. Many of us, I think, who are blessed to have had a great childhood can share an experience of having at least someone, if not many, who convinced us we were special. We weren't particularly special, but they convinced us that we could do anything, that we could be anything, that we would stand tall. My mother would say, don't you let people tell you who you are. You tell them who you are.
Yes.
But, she was tough. My mother would also, when I got, into like my 20s, I was like, Mommy, the thing about this, and I would say, you never took my side, right? Why? Well, because I'd come home as a kid with a problem or something had happened at school. And I'd say, well, this happened, that happened. And whereas other parents might, oh, honey, baby, what happened? I'll take care of you. My mother would just look at us and say, well, what did you do? And what I learned later in life is that she was also teaching us that we had agency. That we had or should think of what role could we or did we play in anything that happened, and how could we take control of that moment and think about it that way. But she was an extraordinary woman, extraordinary.
I'm going to circle back to her.
Okay.
Too. I want to talk a little bit about sisterhood. When I got the call to do this, I was actually not in town this week. And I remember I was like, you know what, I want to rearrange everything, and not just because it's you and you're amazing, but it's her and she's amazing. But because you are the ultimate woman's woman, I knew you'd do it for me,
Yes,
and I knew you'd do that for any of your female friends.
Yep.
And you are so, the thing about Kamala is she's everything you'd hope she'd be, truly. And so I want to talk to you about your mother's female friends,
Yes.
because I know that, as James Baldwin says, we rarely listen to our elders, but we never fail to imitate them.
That's right.
And
That's
so,
great. Yeah, no,
you kind of say that her female friends were more like her sisters.
That's right.
And what do you think is the value of seeing those strong and powerful female friendships? And who are those women in your life? Who are the women in your group chat, basically?
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. My mother modeled it. Her girlfriends were her sisters, and she theirs. And I mentor a lot of people, men and women, and I have to say all the time, hold on to your friends. Surround yourself with people who not only love you, but will applaud you and cheer you on, and also will not lie to you, not sell you a bag of you-know-what. But friendships are so important. I would not be where I am now. The blessing of a great family, but incredible friends. Those people who you can call in the middle of the night and laugh at the thing you're not supposed to be laughing about, or curse when you need to, or cry when you need to, and without judgment and in a safe place. And my best friend from kindergarten is still one of my closest friends, who I actually talk about in the children's book. I met my husband through one of my best friends. It was a blind date. I talk about that in the book.
The story of her and her husband's courtship in the book is everything. That's like the part where it's like I was reading it, and then all of a sudden I was like,
It's a good
It's
story.
so good. It's so good.
How's that for a teaser?
Yeah. I was like, well, here's the tea.
But friendships are, we can't ever underestimate the power of friendship. We talk about networking and professional relationships and mentors and all of those things that are also components of what makes one and allows one to be successful. But friendships are so critically important. And because it is about people who love you for you, and it's not about your, any of the other things that might be about you, but just in your core. It's really important.
Which, since we did just mention him, Doug,
Yeah,
your husband,
my Dougie,
probably your best friend, who is, he is so awesome. And I loved reading about him and your courtship in the book. And I'd also love to know about kind of what are the greatest lessons you've learned from family and Doug. And, he is so funny and so honest. And I literally wish he was here right now because I feel like we'd just drag him out and make him wave because he's that great. Can you talk to me a little bit about him?
Well, the thing that I love about my husband, Doug, he has a great sense of humor. And he is, I describe him as kind of fully actualized. Like, he is who he is. He's not pretending to be anything he's not. He works hard, he cares about his work, he cares about his family, and he likes to play golf and eat good food. I mean, in a nutshell. Yeah. And it's really great when you can share your life with someone. And I waited to get married.
Yeah.
And I think that one should marry somebody who will be your best friend and with whom you can laugh and be comfortable. And that's who he is. And he's also a great sous chef.
Yeah.
I've taught him how to chop the onions. And we have Cole and Ella.
Yes.
Who
your mamala too.
I am their mamala. So
yes.
That's the name they gave me because we don't like the word stepchild and stepmom, and that's not the word we use.
Yeah.
And they are my children, and I'm their mamala.
Yeah.
And
how old were they again when you and Doug got? They were
13 and 17. Yeah.
Was it difficult navigating that, or what was it?
Well, I'm the child of divorced parents, and so when we met, and Doug's parents and Doug's sister is actually here somewhere, Jamie, and his parents have been married for decades upon decades and are still married, Mike and Barb, and
are they in New Jersey still?
They are in California now, but New Jersey is very much in them. In a very big way, unedited.
Oh my God, I love it.
I mean, I'm going to tell you, so you brought it up, I'm going to tell you it's not in the book. So the first time I meet my mother-in-law.
Oh, this isn't in the book, so this is just
Barbara
for us.
Emhoff. So the first time I meet and then, and they're originally from Brooklyn. Okay, so the first time I meet my mother-in-law, she looks at me, she puts my face in her hand. So it's Barb and Mike, my father-in-law's Mike. She puts my face in her hand, she looks at me and she says, "Oh, look at you. You're prettier than you're on television. Mike, look at her."
No.
I swear to you. I have never told that story publicly.
I'm glad you saved it for a room of New Yorkers. Oh my.
There you go.
Oh my gosh. I don't even know where to go from there actually now. You got me there actually. Is it replaying in your mind as well? Yes, okay. Well, do you want to bring it back to your mom for a second? Are there any traditions from her that you've carried on in your family with Cole and Ella?
Well, one is cooking. My mother was a fabulous, just an incredible cook. And I mean, I tell this story. My mother was, she cooked like she did science. So she experimented. So, I mean, I would go to school and everyone was always curious about what was in my lunch bag. Because it was like, she had this whole, there was like this time, it was a stretch of time where she did all these really creative things with cream cheese. So it was olives with cream cheese on dark rye and Doritos. Or like she just, and then it was bacon mixed with cream cheese on like light rye. And then it was like, she did all of these things, but she was an incredible cook, and I loved to cook as a result. I would just, sit with her when she was cooking, and so I have a real thing about Sunday family dinner. And wherever I am, it's so important to me to get home to cook Sunday family dinner. And it's everybody knows it, and my in-laws, friends, whoever is in town will come. The kids can have their friends over, and we have a routine. And so sometimes if I have the time to do it, I'll start thinking about it from that Friday and actually preparing Saturday, marinating things or whatever. And then sometimes I don't have a lot of time, and so it might be, like fish tacos and just pull that together. But we have a whole routine. Cole loves music, and so he sets the music and he sets the table. Ella she does like incredible guacamole, and she'll do that with avocados, or she'll make a dessert. Doug will have his onion goggles on and chop onions.
There's a paragraph on these onion goggles in the book, and enjoy it when you get there.
And that's a really important tradition for me. It's a very special time, and the way that I was raised, the best family time is over a good meal. Yeah. So, yeah.
Last time I saw you was at Spelman when you were there, and so you were speaking. You were literally bringing down I would say house. We were in a chapel.
We were in a chapel, right?
And you were talking about your Howard days.
Yes.
And I want to talk. How did you choose Howard? Yeah. And why was it important to you that you attended that school?
So many members of my extended family attended Howard, so I grew up hearing stories about Howard. And then, of course, Thurgood Marshall went to Howard, and he was one of my inspirations as a child. He's the reason I wanted to become a lawyer. And so I always wanted to go to Howard, and I went to Howard. And Howard is, and there are many schools, many HBCUs in particular, that provide this opportunity where you go and you are presented with no false choices. So, for example, you go, and I talk about this in the book, there's a grass area in the middle of campus. It's almost the size of a city block. It's called the Yard. And you could stand in the middle of the Yard and look over there and see young African Americans between the age of 18 and 24 at the School of Fine Arts. And over there in lab jackets in the School of Medicine, or in the School of Business, or the homecoming queen, or the football star, or the members of the debate team. And invariably the football star is also on the debate team, and the science student is also the homecoming queen, and so on and so on, and you get the point. And in large part, I have a theory actually about how I think we need to trifurcate our system, in particular among those who are in our public systems. We only just barely 100 years ago created a juvenile justice system. And then we treat everybody else who's over the age of 18 as though they're an adult. But let's be clear about something. When we are in college, and this is the point about Howard, 18 through 24 years old, that's that phase of life when we really are figuring out who we are. We're really figuring out our identity and what is our capacity. And it will be reinforced or suppressed based on the environment around us. So when you're at that formative phase of life, in an environment that tells you you can be anything and you don't need to fit into anyone's box about who they think you are or what your capacity is, it is incredibly empowering. It's where I ran for my first office. I was freshman class representative of the Liberal Arts Student Council. And so that's really important. So I kind of veered off, but I also want to say about what I think we need to do with the system. I think that also there is so much that we do, and this is a separate point, not about Howard, but what we do around that phase of life that is the 18 through 24-year-old phase of life. And we treat them as though they are adults when we know that when there are kids and they're in college, we call them college kids. But when they're in the system, they're considered adults, period, because they've reached the age of 18. But let's remember about when we put them in college. What do we do with them? We put them in dormitories with an RA. Why? Because they make stupid decisions. And we also know they're in that phase of life where they are going to be molded and directed and shaped into being incredible adults when they get out in the real world. And so I think also it is very important, and I talk about that in the book as just an extension of the broader point about how we think of college students differently than we think about an 18 through 24-year-old who might be in public systems, and how we treat them. And we really need to check ourselves and understand that there is no difference between any of the kids, our kids, and those kids who are otherwise in the system in terms of the fact that they are still kids.
It is amazing because, and this is so evident in the book as well, but you are just never not finding a problem and then trying to fix it. You never are not in search of the answer for fixing the problem. You don't even stay in the problem that long. You just jump straight. I mean, you're probably that girlfriend that everyone's calling if like something's going, like shit's hitting the fan in their life. You're like, what should I do? You're like, okay, I've got a plan. You know, it is really amazing to witness. For me, you are definitely the person when the media, as I'm sure you can all relate to, is driving you insane, as being the person who is so solid and collected and focused on a plan and not in the hysterics or trying to, allow our, you don't amp us up even more, and especially when it comes to criminal justice reform, you're really the person that I look to as the North Star on that. And you wrote the book Smart on Crime in 2009. Yeah. And I want to talk about how far you think we've come since you wrote that book. Yeah, and that's great. And what more has to be done, and what is at stake?
That's a great question, Cleo. So I think we have come a long way in a short time on criminal justice policy, and we still have a long way to go. When I started as a prosecutor and created Back on Track, there were very few reentry initiatives in the country. And people would say to me and opine, why is she doing this? Her job is to put people in jail, not let them out. Wow. It took an incredible amount of effort. In fact, this is when I coined this phrase that, which I would talk with my team about, look, political capital doesn't gain interest. So no need to just let it sit there. You might as well spend it, right? And so there was a little bit of spending of political capital we had to do to create that initiative. And it ended up working, but it was difficult to do. It was something that was not done. But now you look at, 10 years later, there are reentry initiatives all over the country. And it's great to see. So in that way, and with some other examples, we've come a long way. But when you look at the statistics and you look at the facts and you watch the evening news, we know we still have a long way to go. And I talk a lot about it in the book. We have a long way to go in terms of very stark and distinct and clear racial disparities. We have a long way to go when we look at what is also not only a criminal justice issue, but economic justice issues in terms of how people are treated in the system. For example, on the issue of bail, and since in the Senate, I actually sponsored a piece of legislation to reform America's money bail system, because there are people who are sitting in jail right now simply because they don't have the money in their back pocket to pay bail, and there are others who have committed the same offense who had the money to pay bail and are out, and that obviously is not reflective of a system of justice, right? Where poor people sit in jail and people who have money get out.
Yeah, one of your quotes was criminal justice system that punishes you for poverty.
Yes.
That's something
That's
I wrote
right.
in the book.
That's right. And so there's a lot to do. There's a lot more to do. We just recently passed a piece of legislation, the First Step Act, which was, I was slow to sign on to it because I really felt it didn't do enough, but it was a good first step. And so I did end up supporting it as a first step. And that's about, continuing to deal with the disparities around powder and crack cocaine. It's about sentencing around mandatory minimums, what we need to do to retroactively apply. There's so much we need to do still around drug offenses. We have criminalized a public health issue, and we've got to get our heads on straight about that. We have got to deal with the fact that ridiculous war on drugs was a farce. It was ineffective, it is outdated, and it is a waste of money. And it is a waste of money. And it's not achieving whatever the intended goal was. If it was about public safety, it's certainly in achieving that. And so, so there's still a lot of work to do. Yeah. But we've got, for example, initiatives that are about supporting people who think this way, think about being smart on crime, who are running for prosecutor around the country, and I find that very exciting. And what I think is really important is that we also appreciate the nuance. Those of us who know that the system needs to be reformed also know that if one human being kills another human being, if a woman is raped, if a child is molested, there should be serious consequence and accountability. And so it is about also remembering that we should not be seduced by anyone into accepting false choices about what is the purpose of the criminal justice system.
Yeah. One of the stories that really melted my heart in the book was when you performed the marriage for the same-sex couple in the fight to reverse Prop 8. Can you tell me why that fight was so important to you, and also tell us a little bit about that, about Sandy and Chris?
So, actually, it was in February of 2004. I took office as DA of San Francisco January 8th, 2004. The Valentine's weekend, San Francisco, we decided to start marriages of same-sex couples. Gavin Newsom was the mayor at the time. Dennis Herrera was the city attorney. There were a bunch of folks who decided this is the right thing to do, and so let's do it. And so I stopped by City Hall, and let me tell you what I saw. And it's a beautiful building architecturally, and it occupies a full square block. And I pulled up to see families wrapped around this whole block, and down the street, and down the street, and down the street, with pure joy. Families of every age, of every ethnicity, and there's something, I'm sure, in science or physics about when you have such a large number of people in such a specific space and what that does to the air in terms of the joy, pure joy. So I got out the car, and it was the assessor at the time, and she ran down the steps and she said, "Kamala, can you perform some marriages? We need more people." And I was like, "Sure." And so I went up, and there we were, the few of us who were elected officials who could perform marriages in every nook and cranny of City Hall. Just drive-by weddings, right? Literally, and it was incredible. And then, of course, and I talk about this whole thing in the book, but then it happened that the court invalidated, and so on and so on. And so fast forward, you can read the book. Then fast forward.
You're like, please read the book.
But please read the book. To Prop 8. And so when I ran for Attorney General, it was at the time that the voters, sadly, regrettably, the voters of California passed Proposition 8, which denied same-sex couples the ability to marry. And so it was being litigated, and I said that if I was elected Attorney General, I was not going to defend Prop 8. My opponent said he would. My opponent said he would. And there's a long story, again, about that election night, because election night in that election took place over 21 days. And that was 21 days after my opponent declared his victory. But let's bypass all of that drama for a moment. And so I refused to defend it. It went to the United States Supreme Court on a standing issue, and the Supreme Court did the right thing, said that they didn't have standing in any event. Sandy Steer and Chris Perry, one of the two couples that the litigation was about, they were on their way back to California, and they called me and said, would you perform the first marriage? And so I did, and it was incredible. And it was an incredible day, and it was, you know, it marks a moment in the ongoing fight that we have for equality in our country. And it gets back to the earlier point we were making. This is an ongoing process. You know, Coretta Scott King famously said, and I'll paraphrase, the fight for civil rights, which, you know, that means the fight for equality, the fight for justice, the fight for freedom, the fight for civil rights must be fought and won with each generation. And I think she had 2 points then. One being, it's the very nature of these fights, that whatever gains we make will not be permanent. It's the nature of it. So the second point then is, understanding it is the nature of it, do not despair. Don't throw up our hands when it's time to roll up our sleeves. And so that's what that moment was. It was one of those moments where the fight won, and we still have more work to do on that issue in terms of the equality under the law for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and equality under the law for so many others. And we can go down the list and talk about a lot of it in the book. I'm just going to be shameless right now on the book.
It's really good though, y'all. You know, I have more questions, but I just got some audience questions, and they're already making me smile so much, so I'm just going to ask my last one.
Okay.
Which is, you know, I saw your article recently in the New York Times about your mother's illness and America's healthcare system, and it's just so honest and it's so gripping. And why do you think it's important to share that? Why did you feel it was important to share this? Where you also talk about it in the book. And
well, it was, you know, this prompts me to share another thing, which was, it was difficult to write it. It was really difficult to write it. And, you know, I was raised to not talk about one's feelings. You don't talk about your feelings. You don't talk about yourself. You know, you do. Nobody has time to hear, you know, you do. Get the stuff done. There's so much that needs to get done. But, you know, I think that it is important and it is fair that people want context. And there is also so much context in terms of why I find certain issues important or fought for them. And so on the issue of health care, first of all, you know, my mother, from my earliest days of memory, was passionate about women's health issues and would talk about how, as a scientist, she was acutely aware not only about women's health issues, but people of color, who, you know, because there's so much about scientific research that is going to be a function of who decides to fund it. And people generally like to fund the thing that affects them. And so many of the people who are affected, who are women or people of color or people who don't have resources, may find that their health issues that is specific to them genetically is not getting the kind of attention it should. And so I was just aware of these disparities at a very young age. And then going through, my mother ended up having cancer. So a cancer specialist ended up having cancer. And she was sick for a couple of years. She went into remission. It was up and down. And I just, you know, had she not had Medicare, you know, and when I walked up and down those halls and I looked at, if anyone has had this unfortunate experience of being in a hospital with a family member who is facing an acute illness, and you know what it's like being there in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day, and you walk by so many rooms, and most of the rooms are open, and you see people who are there by themselves, people who don't speak English as a first language, people who have been raised to honor and respect the person with the white lab coat and not ask questions. And you just see the disparities based on income, based on so many other things. And I feel very strongly that we've got to give all people access to meaningful health care, and that it should not be thought of as a privilege. It must be understood to be a right.
Mm. Okay. What a dream, you know? So we're almost out of time, so I have time for maybe two. I know, I don't want to go either. We have time for 2 questions, so I'm going to do this one first just because it looks so funny.
Okay.
This one says, what's the deal with the wall?
Right. Right.
So someone from our audience with great handwriting wants to know, what's the deal with the wall?
It's the president's vanity project. You know, I mean, listen, if we deconstruct, get the pun, deconstruct wall. If we deconstruct the issue, you know, let's be clear, and again, let's just point to the facts and the evidence and the data. And the fact is that we are not facing a crisis. The crisis we're facing is a crisis of leadership. That's the crisis. That's the crisis. And a wall won't cure that. And a wall won't cure that. And so there is, you know, there is so much that is about these powerful voices, again, sowing hate and division among us and vilifying a group of people because it's a distraction from the fact that you've got Mueller investigating. It's a distraction from the fact that people know that I have traveled this country, and people know, and it's a distraction from the fact that people know you're touting the economy. But people know, and I hear the stories countless times over and over again. People, yeah, they're working. You want to talk about the jobless numbers? People are working, yeah, and they're working 2 and 3 jobs to pay the bills. These are the things people know, and this is a distraction. See this shiny thing over here? Plus, the bottom line is this, and I have focused on transnational criminal organizations. Remember, I'm a prosecutor. I have focused on that. That wall ain't gonna stop them. Like, it's just...
She'll hit you with the truth real hard.
So it's not, and it's, you know, $5 billion. Let's talk about that also. $5 billion that could go into America's aging infrastructure. You know this in the tri-state area, the bridges and the roads that are falling apart, and it's all over the country. We put it into what we need to do to have meaningful, affordable childcare for American families.
Yeah.
Let's put it into a public education system that is being drained of the resources it needs. $5 billion is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're also, that he has allowed the government to be shut down around essential services, and here's the farce and the inconsistency also. You're aware, the reports are today, there are, you know, members of the FBI who are furloughed, TSA agents who are quitting or can't go to, well, their job is about public safety. So what's the priority exactly again?
Right.
What is the priority? Right.
So I know we are out of time, but this question is on actually about half these cards.
Okay.
So I have to ask it. Hypothetically,
Yeah.
and asking for a friend, you know, if you were president, how would you bring this country together?
I would remind us of what we all know in our hearts and our souls. The vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. I said that earlier, and I really mean it. I mean it when I know and think about who we are, and when I think about when those of us wake up in the middle of the night, and there are so many of us who do, in the middle of the night with the thought that's been weighing on us. You know, some people call it the witching hour, the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. For the vast majority of Americans, when we wake up in the middle of the night with that thought, maybe in a cold sweat, we are never thinking that thought through the lens of the party with which we're registered to vote. We are never thinking that thought through the lens of some demographic a pollster put us in. And for the vast majority of us, when we wake up thinking that thought, it has to do with one of just a very few things. Our personal health, the health of our children or our parents. For so many Americans, can I get a job, keep a job, pay the bills by the end of the month, retire with dignity? For our students, can I pay off those student loans? The vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us, and we have to hold on to that knowledge and paint a picture of the future and have a vision of the future in which everyone can see themselves. It's critically important. And I believe we can achieve that, but not if we don't fight. We got to fight to get there. Yeah. We got to fight to get there, and it's worth it. And it is worth it because all said and done, flawed though we may be, imperfect though we may be, this country is worth fighting for.
And they told me I had a little more time, so I'm just going to ask you, though,
As a follow-up.
So, yeah, as a follow-up. I would love to know kind of what goes into your kind of self-preparation. I mean, one of the questions someone asked was, how do you prepare for Senate hearings?
Yeah.
And I love this compliment they also gave you. You are always calmer, more precise, and less ego-driven than everyone else. And I'd love to know just what goes into being you to be, I mean, I have barely been able to think on this stage because I'm in constant awe of you.
Oh,
so
stop.
How?
But here.
How? Do you, what's your process and what's
Yeah.
your preparation and
Yeah.
what's your kind of, even your self-care routine? I'd love to know.
So the process of preparation is extensive. There's a lot of homework that goes into it. I have an incredible team of really smart people. In preparing for hearings, for example, they will all come and sit in my office, and we will start to play around with, we'll go from macro. Well, what are the big issues? What are the things we're concerned about? What are the things that the people at home who are watching are concerned about? Let's now deconstruct it again. My staff that I've had, through the years, they all joke with each other about the various sayings I have, and one of them is, show me the math. I'm big on show me the math. Don't just offer conclusions. Let's not offer them to the American public. Let's not work on those. We need to question the premise. Let's not make assumptions in anything we do. So it's about showing the math and showing what is going into and explaining what goes into these processes in terms of government processes and making sure that we explain that when we're asking questions. But, ultimately it's, and maybe this is my training as a courtroom lawyer, when I'm sitting there, I just want to know the truth. I just want to know what happened. Yeah. And so for me, it's not about me giving a beautiful speech. It's about literally what happened. Yeah. I need to know. And sometimes then that interaction is, and I know you're not telling me. But that's it. Because remember, everyone should play in position in moments like that. We are there as members of the United States Senate in our capacity in oversight, right? Remember that the United States Senate has the responsibility to provide oversight over all these government agencies that come before us. And so this is about another reason why we should be optimistic. It is about the beauty of the design of our democracy. So here's the thing. Think of our democracy or the republic as being a tabletop. It stands on 4 legs. And those 4 legs, 3 independent, co-equal branches of government, and a free and independent press. And the beauty of the design is that the framers presupposed moments like this. They imagined moments like this, where those checks and balances would have to come in play. And so when the executive branch says that DACA recipients can no longer, the courts, independent branch, you've gone too far. What happens? For political reasons, you want to strip millions of Americans of access to affordable health care, the Affordable Care Act. And what happens? Congress, remember that moment with the late, great John McCain? Congress acted and said, no, you've gone too far. I am certain that had the press corps, which has been engaged in incredible investigative journalism, but I'll give you an example. I am certain that had they not trucked on down to the border while babies were being ripped from the arms of their parents, the American public never would have seen the atrocity, the human rights abuses that were being created by the United States government. And so what ended up happening? The American public saw it because the press did their job, and the American public said, oh no, that's going too far. And they put pressure on their representatives such that, at least on paper, the administration ended that policy. So let's remember that. Yeah, we're being kind of, our democracy is kind of, if you think of it as a house, I'm going to change metaphors. She said it was a table. Okay, now I'm going to go with a house. So yeah, we're kind of experiencing a natural disaster. And some of the shingles are kind of falling off, but the house is still standing. Right. The house is still standing. And that's what's really important, back to the earliest points about, how and from where we should derive our optimism and our sense of, is it worth it, and can we do this, and who are we? We're still standing.
You're someone who has your feet so firmly set in what you know to be right. And at the same time, you're also able to work on bipartisan legislation. Yeah. And so I do want to know what advice you have for all of us when we might be talking to our neighbors who don't agree with what we feel is right. And how are you moving through that in your space, both at work and as you move through the world?
Yeah. So I think of often your question and that issue, I think of it as a Venn diagram. So, those 3 circles. Those 3 circles, by the very nature of a Venn diagram, will never completely overlap. But that area in the middle, in my experience, is always ripe for expansion. And so that's how I think about it. So, for example, I have 3 pieces of legislation that I'm very proud of that are bipartisan. One was actually passed into law, which was with Tim Scott, a Republican, and it was about finally making it making lynching a federal crime. After hundreds of years, but it got done. With James Lankford out of Oklahoma, a Republican. He and I disagree on most policy issues, but we agree on some, and one of them was a bill that we created to improve and upgrade the various states' election infrastructure systems so that we can avoid, as much as possible, another adversary from interfering in our elections. But I'll share with you a third one because I have a little story about it that makes this point. And it's, because it was actually my first piece of bipartisan legislation. When I got to the Senate, I was hoping to work in a bipartisan way. And so, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit. I started walking the halls like, let me try and find a Republican to work with. And so I knocked on the door of this dude. His name is Rand Paul. I got this bill.
Casual.
And it's about bail, money bail. And I'm wondering if you might work with me on it. He said, well, Kamala, tell me what it's about. And I said, well, the way it works around the country is somebody is arrested for shoplifting, let's say. And they get arrested, they go to a court, the judge will look at a bail schedule and say, okay, your bail is $20,000, which is kind of around average bail in the United States. And if you pay the bail, you can get out while you wait trial, and if you can't, you sit in jail. And I said, Rand, you know that most people in our country do not have $20,000 sitting around. And so what ends up happening is this. Let's say it's a woman in the courtroom who's been accused of the crime. She may look at the back to the audience, and her family may say, well, we got to get Auntie out of jail. And so what are they going to do? They're going to walk across the street from what is across the street every courthouse in America, the bail bondsman. The bail bondsman will say, I'll give you that $20,000, but you got to give me 10%, which you will not get back. That's $2,000. Well, the average American does not have $2,000 sitting around. So one of just a few scenarios will happen. That family will beg, borrow, and steal to get that $2,000. Or she will sit in jail for what could be days, weeks, months, even years. Or, equally possible, her attorney will come to her and say, if you plead guilty, you'll get credit for time served and you can get out. And so even if she has a defensible case, imagine if she has children at home and she's a single mom, knowing that if those children are at home by themselves, Child Protective Services might come and take them. What do you think she's going to do, weighing her options? All because she didn't have the money to get out pending trial. And so to make the point even more stark, someone who committed the same act, who happens to have money, will walk out of that place. That is obviously an injustice. And back to my earlier point, it's not only about the criminal justice the system that needs reform, this is also an economic justice issue. So I talked to him about it. I said, so the bill that I want to propose is that we create incentives to get rid of the money bail system in the country. And he said, I like it. So he co-sponsored it. Wow. And so we wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that got published, and it was like on a Thursday. And I went back to California, and I was thinking, I need to check on old boy and see how he's doing with this, right? The thing got published, so I was like, hey, and so I got in touch with him, hey, Rand, how you people doing with it? You good? And he said, Kamala, Appalachia loves this.
Wow.
Because the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us, right?
There you go. My best friend DeRay defines hope as, he says, hope is the belief that our tomorrows can be better than our todays.
Right.
Hope is not magic, it is work.
That's right.
And I want to thank you for giving us the hope and also showing us the work.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Cleo
so
Wade.
much.
So good.